We are almost at the end, but it is not the end. Last but not least, we have Zac Williamson, CEO of Aztec Protocol, who has been building one of the first ZK rollups in our space and have been advancing the mission of privacy applications. We are really, really excited to learn more about what you guys have learned in building for the past 5 years and what the next 5 years of Aztec and ZK looks like. Welcome, Zac.
Thank you. Hello. So yes, I'm Zac. I am the CEO of Aztec. We are a privacy preserving layer 2 on Ethereum for end-to-end encrypted blockchain transactions. So yeah, I'm going to bring out my crystal ball today and try to predict the future. I figured, it would be a nice way to end today by thinking about what's the end game, what are we all building towards, what's the world going to look like, yeah, what are the key ingredients of the future going to be? Is this all going to turn into something useful or not? Spoiler alert: I think it will, but I'm biased. Yeah, got 3 parts to this. Basically, let's just go back to basics. Why is Web3 valuable? Why is it useful? And why is it challenging? What is the tech landscape going to look like in the future? As in, like, just the mechanical, technological components that we will be using, and what features will this create? I think there are 3 possible paths, and we've not yet done enough to articulate between each 3. So, all right, why are we here? Basically, what is the point of Web3? It's, going back to 2008, to the Bitcoin paper, it was revolutionary because it was the first time in world history where multiple people could come together and determine how much of an asset they each owned without having to rely on a third party to tell it for them. The idea of having some kind of record of ownership without a custodian. I think that this is going to be looked back on in the future as something as revolutionary as double-entry bookkeeping in the Italian Renaissance in terms of what it enables, because that ability to cut out middlemen and create this trust infrastructure where multiple parties can coordinate amongst each other without having to get custodians involved, it's very liberating, and it massively lowers, in theory, the barriers of entry to for humans to coordinate amongst one another, to participate in shared endeavors. We're starting to see some of this with DAOs, but obviously very early stages there. But the composability of blockchain networks, as well as its permissionlessness, is extraordinarily powerful because it starts to it flips on its head the traditional efficiencies one gains from vertically integrated organizations. In a composable network, every single node in that network, so every application, dApp, smart contract library, it adds value to every other node because you can incorporate those technologies, those solutions in a completely permissionless manner in your own products and services. You don't need to ask anybody for permission. You can just use it. In the same way that, Uniswap can use existing tokens that have been deployed. If I'm doing an app that's that needs to transmit or transfer assets, I can use Uniswap. Don't need to ask anyone. It just works, in theory. And that trustlessness part. This is in stark contrast to the traditional way of organizing enterprises, where you typically have products and services that are heavily permissioned. You may have regulatory capture. You leverage efficiencies by vertically integrating and trying to squeeze out competition and diversity in your ecosystem. And the critical reliance on trusted third parties really does undermine consumers in many ways, because it opens up alternative business models that are predatory to the user and not value accretive. So yeah, Web3, it's good. We like it. What are the problems? Well, there's the blockchain trilemma. Hello. I think everyone's seen a diagram like this when they were learning what is the blockchain. So you've got your 3 trade-off spaces, basically. These aren't problems that you can solve. As in, you've got to pick somewhere on this diagram. You can maximize one at the expense of the other 2. But there is no way of having your cake and eating it, at least with one canonical ledger. And so this translates into concrete problems of scalability. How do you get high throughput in your blockchain? You have modularity where, okay, so in theory, you know, every smart contract, every library, every piece of Web3 tooling is composable with everything else, except in practice, well, no, it's hard to use. The tooling is terrible, and you get massive ecosystem fragmentation as people move to L2s to acquire greater throughput. As you have diversification of L1s, then assets are basically just split across a large number of chains. It opens up security risks. It makes price discovery harder. And there's also the rather critical problem, I think, that everything right now is transparent. And we'll get into why that's a big deal later on in this presentation. I'd like to point out that of the problems that I've articulated, and I think the problems generally that persist in this space at the infrastructure level or the network level, privacy is very unique in that it's not spawned from the blockchain trilemma, and can therefore, in theory, be completely solved. So where are we going to, like, how are these intangible value adds of Web3 going to actually translate into things that are a bit more practical? Because right now, we've not really achieved the grand cypherpunk dreams of 2008 or 2015. Web3 is, whilst it's useful and valuable, it very rarely touches individuals' lives, other than maybe they own crypto as an investment. But they don't use crypto infrastructure for payments, for identity, for coordination as coordination layers. That's still very much future technology, the stuff that the people in this conference is trying to bring to life. So I think that in the future, when the technology becomes more mature, when it's easier to use, when the barriers to entry are lower, we're going to see three really key use cases, which I can get into now. So there's the basic one of like just better Web 2. So you leverage that composability and that permissionlessness of Web3 transaction networks to provide products and services that you normally have to go through Web 2 to get, things like micropayments, things like media, which can transform into decentralized social media. Basically, you enable existing products that exist in the Web 2 landscape, but either with different business models or you leverage the efficiency benefits of Web3 to crush down barriers to entry. So yeah, things like I think identity is going to be an enormous one in the future. The idea of having basically composable open identity standards is absolutely huge. You don't have that right now in the world, right? If I want to prove that I'm a human being with a high degree of confidence, well, there's lots of ways of doing that, but there is no standard. Like, there's no API that I can talk to figure out if somebody is a human being. I know WorldCoin's trying to solve this in a very unilateral way, and I think that Web3 can also create much more organic ways of solving this by accreting multiple identity standards together. Things like open micropayment networks, decentralized social media. This stuff, the products and services that these things spawn, they exist in Web 2. It's just that I think that Web 3 can do them more efficiently if we get the technology stack right. But then there's the basic, obvious one of Web 3 is money, right? That's the kind of originally that was the whole point of cryptocurrency. Originally it was this concept of Bitcoin as sovereign money, digital gold, but it goes much further and beyond that with Ethereum, where in theory, if you had a legal system which was advanced enough to handle this, you could digitize real-world assets, existing assets, and create legal records of reference to them on a blockchain network, where all the information required to trade that asset would travel with the asset, where you would have strong identity protocols that can act in a permissionless way to validate whether transactions are valid, whether ownership is valid in compliance with local laws. And what it would enable you to do is create a single unified ledger that contains the world's assets, and that would change the world. It would change the world because it would make assets look a lot like money, basically. They'd be extraordinarily fungible because they'd be programmable and swappable amongst each other. You have assets that will be sitting in a filing cabinet, in some regional bank in a basement somewhere, suddenly become liquid and tradable. And it would massively crush the barrier to entry to providing financial services. The entire raison d'etre for banks existing that need to generate leverage kind of goes away in a world where assets are routinely digitized and traded on chain because you massively increase the velocity of money. And with that, the actual need for leverage decreases because the need for liquidity in your financial system decreases. So yeah, that's a thing. We've kind of forgotten about it, I think, because it's hard and requires a lot of technological components that do not yet exist. So we're chasing lower-hanging fruit as an industry. But in my opinion, this was and still is the holy grail. And then you have Web3 as a coordination engine. The unsexy, boring thing of just getting human beings to coordinate with each other to achieve shared goals. Basically, things like a DAO. Where, yeah, basically peer-to-peer collaboration, being able to distribute, to acquire and distribute shared assets according to shared goals. I think there is something quite revolutionary within the seeds of Web3 that's not yet fully been expressed here, which is that Web3 is very good, very efficient, I believe, at connecting capital with labor. I'll give you an example about this. So what Aztec's doing, right? It's been a long road for Aztec. It's been 7 years now since I started. I trained from scratch to become a cryptographer. I had to create, with a lot of help and a lot of guidance, some novel research to advance the state of the art. We've been spending a lot of years grinding away at the cliff face, building out this decentralized distributed private transaction layer. We're VC funded. We've been going for 7 years. We are effectively a glorified research project right now. We are intending to build and deploy very useful network that's going to be very value accretive. But the path to doing that has been an enormous amount of R&D that's cost tens of millions of dollars over 7 years. You can't do this in any other industry. Maybe pharma, but then only you'd only get VCs investing in sure bets there, very large institutions. You would never get this kind of investment from private capital into random little startups. But you get it in Web3. So I think that I think this still is yet to be fully articulated, but I do think that the business models within Web3 do enable this a much more long-term investment strategy, oddly enough, than other sectors of the economy. And it's very effective at aligning incentives because it's very easy to give people skin in the game. If it's either through tokenomics or something else, but generally in Web3, the people actually putting in the work, their reward is not just salary, it's equity, it's tokens, it's something which tracks with the actual value that's being created by the network or product or service that's being created. This isn't that revolutionary in the realm of startups, but it is everywhere else. And yeah, being able to create organizations that more directly align incentives so the people putting in the work are incentivized to actually create a good outcome. There's something revolutionary about that. That already exists. You can do that today in the real world. I'm just saying that I think Web3 makes it easier. In theory, if you have advanced DAO infrastructure. It's a bit like how I could start a company in the UK or the US, or I could start one in Venezuela. But it's much harder to do it in Venezuela. I'm just trying to say here, this isn't revolutionary. It's not saying, oh, you can do something new. I'm just saying you can do existing stuff more effectively with Web3 and the tools that Web3 creates. So I'm going to make some predictions that within the next, I'm going to say 10 years. I hope it's less, but governments are slow. Decentralized organizations, there's going to be a pathway to grant a decentralized organization that of a legal person. So a legal person is an entity that can sign contracts, it can own assets, it can be held liable for its actions, and it can hold other people liable for their actions. Basically, this is at least in the UK, there's only 2 entities that have these kinds of rights: people and companies. I think companies were added in the 1700s, so it's a small list. It doesn't change that often, and I think it's going to change again. And that decentralized organizations are going to thrive by being goal-driven. So let me give an example. Let's say, in the late 1990s, Google sets out to solve search. Right? Search is terrible. We want to solve search. They do. Great. They make a lot of money on selling search services. Would the world have been a better place if Google didn't expand beyond that? If they basically just shed a load of talent, we're like, okay, we've nailed search, we've done that. We have our pot of gold. We're just going to keep doing search, but we're not going to try and grow. Well, think of all the talent that would have liberated into the marketplace and all the innovation. I mean, large tech companies are quite firmly anti-competitive in that they explicitly hire out of the market to soak up talent. But those kinds of goal-driven organizations are, you can't effectively do them with companies because companies have shareholders. Companies have a mandate to deliver shareholder value. And so the idea of a company kind of killing itself after fulfilling its mandate or at least like pausing that desire for inexorable growth is an anathema. But I think there are plenty of cases where those kinds of organizations that are goal-driven, that will expire once the goal has been achieved, are very useful, very virtuous, and it's basically impossible to create one these days. And this goes into something else, I think, that Web3 can help solve. If you want to get shit done in this world, you really have two vehicles you can use. You can use a charity or an NGO, or you can use a limited liability corporation. Or you could go into politics, but good luck with that. And these both have extreme strengths and weaknesses. For a company, your requirements to deliver shareholder value are absolute. And you can't put principles above your shareholders. You'll get replaced. The board will kick you out. And for a charity, yes, your mission is values driven, but you have absolutely terrible incentive alignment. You have horrendous inefficiencies and an enormous difficulty attracting talent because of those misaligned incentives. And I think there's something missing in the middle, where it's not possible right now to have an organization, not efficiently at least, that is somewhat values driven, that has a humanitarian style goal, but still has commercial incentives to guide it in the right direction, in the right destination. And to be able to hold those two desires in tension with one another sustainably. And I think this is something where Web3 can actually solve part of the puzzle through new economic incentives. It goes back to this idea of connecting labor with capital, where if you use token incentives right, you can give the people who are actually putting in the work skin in the game. But possibly, if you have some kind of mission which speaks to people's hearts, that you can retain a subsidized level of funding for your endeavor. This is not fully articulated, but I do think some kind of organizations are going to appear in the middle of the spectrum that decentralized networking is going to enable. That's my prediction, at least. So, okay, tech landscape. I've got to speed up. I don't have that long left. What's the technology going to look like? Well, okay, this is actually pretty cookie cutter. You could probably get this from about 24 people in this conference. I think that L1 is going to be the home of asset origination and not much else. I think that L2 is going to be the home of settlement, basically on and off ramps for app chains where identity records are stored. And L3s are going to be where all of the actual real activity happens, and they're going to be application-specific rollups that don't look like rollups, that are going to be very high throughput. That's the fundamental layered architecture, and then you're going to have cross-chain bridging to bind it all together so that you prevent liquidity fragmentation, ZK co-processors so that you reduce computation burdens on these networks, and also the three kind of properties that you need of a blockchain: dataability, execution, and settlement. They're going to be completely independent platforms in 5 to 10 years. What do I think this? Well, L1's bloody expensive. Let's start with L3. So what do I mean by an app chain? It's a rollup. It'll use a tech stack like a ZK stack, an OP stack, or an Aztec stack. It trades off things like data availability and censorship resistance because it doesn't need them. If you're doing some high throughput, low value application, you probably do have some trusted third party in the mix that you can use, but you still want to tap into the composable network of assets that is enabled by Web3, and you want that trust to have an expiry date. Basically, you want to settle on a trustless layer. But whilst the backend will be using rollup technology, it won't look like that to a developer. It'll be much more like building or deploying a Node.js app. You don't have to know how Node.js works to use it. And yeah, app chain development will look like web development, and everything will be abstracted away. L2 will be the settlement layer where these rollups settle, because L1 will be too expensive. It'll be the home of identity and KYC standards because, again, L1 will be too expensive. L2 will be just about cheap enough, in my opinion. But one of the reasons why you'll need these app chains is because there's always going to be tension with L2s between being a network and being an infrastructure layer. When people are developing websites, they don't say, "Oh, I'm going to deploy to the internet." It's a networking layer, and so the need for strong liveness and censorship resistance, what it really does is it makes it a pain in the ass to develop applications on these platforms that don't need these properties. And that need for generality creates developer experience problems that you can solve with specialization at the app chain layer. And L1 is just going to be too bloody expensive for anything other than being digital gold and the primary record of assets, because roll-up transactions will outcompete everything else. Okay, so I'm going to try and be really quick here. Okay, so there are, I think, 3 future paths for Web3 and what we do. The sad, the bad, and the wild. Let's start with the sad part. The sad part is basically we just fail to execute on anything, and we don't fail. We don't succeed in scaling. We don't succeed with solving liquidity fragmentation. You know, and in 5-10 years, everyone's still talking about rollups. And the tooling sucks because the infrastructure bottlenecks prevent good tooling. Well, then, you know, womp womp. Let's all go find jobs in AI or something, because basically this is the failure mode. The bad path is where we succeed with scaling, but we don't acquire privacy. Now, obviously, I have an extraordinary bias here. But, I mean, think about the world we're building. If distributed ledgers remain fully transparent and fully scrutable and legible and inspectable, nation states have always had a neurotic desire for legibility within their societies, to understand, dissect, and disseminate everything that happens. It's a natural part of having a state bureaucracy. You know, if everything you have is a hammer, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think what's going to happen is that this infrastructure that we're building on Web3, well, if you just take out the decentralized part, and you create a centralized ledger, maybe a central bank, digital currency, an institution which has enough heft to effectively force people to use its ledger for digital transactions, then not only do you basically create a warrantless financial surveillance regime without any kind of legislative changes, but you also completely eliminate the need for cash as well. So that, like, that last bastion of financial privacy goes away. Yeah, we're all just basically cogs in a machine. We're all just, you know, we become lumps of coal. We become a resource in a resource economy in that world, because our money isn't within our control anymore. If this reality happens, I'll make another prediction, which is that people will, in 20 years or 15 years, look back at us. They'll look back at our blog posts that talk a grand utopian vision about the future. They will look at people like me getting up on stage in these recorded talks, you know, espousing grand ideas about how we're going to change the world, and they will think that we are the most self-serving, like, egotistical, vain, elitist tech bro bastards that have ever walked the earth, because the reality we will have created will be nothing like what we're talking about. It'll be a bloody living nightmare, except we'll all be very rich. So I want people here to think about that, you know, because we don't. Because what we're doing is fun, right? Building Web3 is fun. The culture's fun. The technology is novel and interesting, and we're building cool stuff that could help people in a lot of ways. But not if we don't have privacy. Then this is all a bloody living nightmare. We're basically creating surveillance technology. So yeah, have fun with that. And the wild path, the wild path is if we have both. If we do find scalability and privacy, then the world gets interesting. Now, I didn't label this the good path, because this path is more anything goes. Because I think all three paths are going to play out in some regard. I think that particularly the bad path, you know, just because you have privacy technology doesn't mean it's going to be used. But if you do have privacy tech built in as a first-class primitive, not just this extra little thing you can bolt on if you really want it, but as a basic standard, then you enable a very, very powerful world. You enable that blockchain as money thesis in a real way, because you can own assets on chain with your real identity without that basically doxing you. It creates monetization and business models for applications where the data stays client-side. And it genuinely, I believe, allows those composability efficiencies I was talking about before to contest the efficiencies from vertical integration. Without privacy, I don't think you have that, because you just don't have identity. And without identity, like, everything that happens on chain just doesn't matter, because it can't be connected to who you are in the real world. So yeah, with the wild path, we're going to see, I think, a battle for influence between these networks that do have strong privacy guarantees that will open up a lot more innovative economic activity. But it will be in tension with very large centralized institutions and nation states that really don't want this technology to exist, because they can't, either as a government because they can't control it, or as a large institution because it's threatening their bottom line. Yeah, hopefully this will win out. You know, if we follow Web 2 as a model, then it doesn't. But hopefully we've learned something over the last 20 years. Well, that's me. Yeah, I'm Zac. Thank you for listening. It's been a pleasure. We've got time for questions? Hello.
Thanks for the talk. You mentioned that you have a prediction about decentralized organizations getting the status of a legal person.
Yes.
I thought maybe you'll tie that into the legal expiry, them dying or anything, but maybe that was a bit separate. But why straight for a legal person? Why not just a company? Right? We have people, we have two you mentioned, right? People and company. Why do they have to go straight for a legal person?
Well, no, people and companies are legal persons. So if you want a decentralized organization to basically own assets and be able to be held liable and hold others liable, that's a legal person.
So legal person and companies, people and companies.
Yes.
All right, now I understand.
Yeah.
So in route with that, like, what do you think about like on-chain LLCs or like the emergence of like, legitimizing either like DAOs, and how can that kind of, I guess, how do we structure like an ecosystem for them so that they can kind of be on that wild path that you just described?
It's a good question. And I think one of the fundamental problems is that, at least to do it in a way that really leverages the efficiencies of Web3, you just can't today because it's a legal problem. Like right now with on-chain LLCs, what you really have to do is you have a real LLC, and the thing on-chain is basically one could argue it's theatrics. Basically, like what happens on chain can be recommendations for what the real board of the company should do, but they're under no obligation legally to do that. And in many jurisdictions, they like them acting in the interests of the on-chain entity could even be illegal. I think we need regulatory change, which means I think that we need to get there. We need to show the world these possibilities. So I think that the kind of infrastructure needs to be there. I think that we need to have these kind of on-chain DAOs that could operate like LLCs, but aren't quite all the way there, but have the fundamental technologies to do so. So I'm a broken record here. I think the missing ingredient, that what we need strong privacy technologies and strong high-quality tooling around it. Specifically with a means to having on-chain identity. If you can have a DAO where the votes are private and treasury management is private, so you can pay people privately, I think that would be a huge step in the right direction.
When you put that sort of like empty space between charity and NGO kind of followingness and the limited liability, in a way that's a very US, UK perspective, because in certain regions like Switzerland, Germany, there's this middle thing called the Verein. Like all the football teams are these Vereins. And they're weird. They're like community owned, but they're profit driven. So like as you described that in-between space, it made me think of that. And I think there are some DAOs that are taking advantage of it. But we're still talking about an existing structure, and then you're kind of trying to use it slightly on chain. But I wonder if like going outside, like who knows what other countries have like these like weird in-between systems. They like, their foundations might be treated differently. So I wonder if that's the way to get it. It's like you find a weird structure somewhere in the world, and then you start to add the digital component, the sort of Web3 component, and then that could become an example for the rest of it.
Yeah, it's a really good thought and a very good observation, useful observation. I think maybe I have a bit of a UK-US blinders on when I'm thinking about this problem, because to be really blunt, if any solutions do exist out there in traditional modes of organization, they haven't scaled that well because they've remained local. So apart from the football clubs, yeah, fair enough. FIFA? There's probably a loophole then, because FIFA is not. Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't hold up FIFA as a model for organization. They're like, yeah. But also, I mean, if we can use technology, use decentralized networks to kind of help these organizations scale, it also lends them legitimacy to be adopted by other Western nations. Because I reckon right now, if you go to America, if you go to Capitol Hill and you're like, hey, you should be more like Germany and Sweden and Switzerland, they probably tell you to F off. But if you say, hey, we've got some brand new technology gadget, that you can use to connect with the 21st century, then they might be more interested. Oh? I learned something. Thank you. Okay.
What do the financial dynamics look like with this kind of set expiry organization you've described? Because it seems almost a little, at least for me, confusing, where you see these DAOs, they get funding, they build stuff out, and then it seems like if they're going to expire, like doesn't that value, does that just go away, or does it go to the people that?
I think expire was a bit too extreme. It's more that like the scope doesn't expand. The idea is, you know, if you set out to solve a problem and you solve it and you make money with the product or service doing that, great. But you don't expand your mandate. You don't have this this growth at all costs model where, you know, if you're making an enormous amount of money, well, why do you have to reinvest it? You know, why not like liberate that talent and that capital into the market and reinvest it in other organizations? So I think, I mean, honestly, blockchain networks can be a good model for this. Take Ethereum, for example. You know, Ethereum delivers an enormous amount of value. It has a foundation whose mandate is to kind of, you know, keep it at the cutting edge, keep the community aligned, make sure it's a useful place to build technology. But it's not growing beyond that. And the organizational structure means that there's no desire to do so. And like, which is great for us, right? Because it means that there's an enormous amount of value being generated by the Ethereum network, and it's not being captured by the foundation. So it's a very, like, if you align the incentives properly, it can be a very positive sum game where the institution that's created an organization or a product or a service, like, instead of it monopolizing all of the economic activity that's enabled, it liberates it out and allows more innovation and more talent to be attracted. Because, you know, if Ethereum did have a more corporate model, it wouldn't be the success it is today. So, yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.